All right, I'm getting the go signal. Well, thank you everybody for joining us both here in person and over the internet today. I am thrilled to host this book talk discussion with Verity Harding, who is visiting us from the UK. I'm going to spend a couple minutes on her bio just so you know who you're hearing from, and then we're going to dive into the content of this new book. So Verity is a globally recognized expert in AI, technology, and public policy. She's currently director of the AI and Geopolitics project at Cambridge University, a new initiative dedicated to a rights-based approach to AI and geopolitics. Verity's career has focused at the intersection of technology and democracy, so we're happy with the mind meld with CDT today. She spent a decade at Alphabet, latterly as DeepMind's first global head of public policy, where in 2017 she co-founded the company's research and ethics unit. She was involved in the founding of the Partnership on AI, a multi-stakeholder organization of which CDT is a civil society partner. And as we'll discuss today, Verity was a member of the OECD's Network of AI Experts in 2018 and 2019, when OECD developed the first set of intergovernmental AI principles that were later adopted by the G20. Prior to this, she was head of security policy for Google in Europe, covering issues such as online extremism and encryption. And then before moving into the tech industry, Verity served the British government as a special advisor to Nick Clegg when he was Deputy Prime Minister. Verity, we're thrilled to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was really great to be here.
So the opening question, why this book and why now?
Yes, well, I wanted to write something that really kind of shared what I felt to be quite privileged knowledge that I had. You know, this experience that I had in both politics and technology. And I wanted to write something that sort of brought all of those things together and said, here's everything I know about this kind of unique space at this unique moment, with the intention of demystifying and getting other people involved. So I think there's a kind of version of AI that has become focused quite gatekeepy, to be honest, and people saying, look, if you don't understand the technology, then you have no place in this conversation. You don't know what you're talking about. And I feel the opposite to that. I feel that actually AI is going to affect so much of society that we need expertise, all different types of expertise to be involved in it. So maybe you don't understand the deep tech itself, but you do understand your area of the world very well. And that's really important to shaping what AI is going to look like in the future. I think that AI will end up being the best version of itself if the most diverse set of perspectives are involved in shaping that. And that's why I sort of got into tech from politics in the first place. You know, I'd seen up close and inside politics, working on the issues of national security, online privacy, and so on, that there was this sort of democratic deficit between what the technologists understood about technology and then what the democratically elected representatives who were supposed to regulate this technology understood about it. And I felt that gap needed breaking down. And so I moved across into the tech sector to try and help technology understand politics and politics understand technology. So now in this moment of AI, when people are starting to see how political technology really is, I think that the fact that I can speak both of those languages means it's important to sort of share that knowledge more broadly with people.
You have this great line in the book where you say, too many people feel that the great AI debate is simply not for them. That's CDT's love language. One of the reasons we exist in the ecosystem is to say, if you have expertise in civil rights or human rights or the effective administration of government programs, we need you in the AI conversation. And actually, that's the way in which the AI conversation is going to move forward. But it's one thing to say it, it's another to actually do it and operationalize it. And so I wonder for you, both in your professional experience and even the reflections from writing this book, how do you actually start cutting into that in a practical way to make it real?
Yes, I think the work that CDT does is so important and has obviously have been a leader in this space for a really long time. And I got to know CDT when I helped to start Partnership on AI and appreciated so much that CDT sort of led with a sense of sort of, cautious trust of us at that space to say, we can see what you're trying to do here with a multi-stakeholder approach, and got involved. And I think that sometimes, what I say in the book is that technology is sort of shaped by the political culture of the time as much as the technology shapes the times itself. So I think often we think about, well, if you think about the Industrial Revolution, the technology comes along and changes society. But of course, society is also changing and deciding what gets made and what doesn't get made at the same time. And I think at the moment we're a pretty polarized society, we're a pretty divided society, we're quite an unequal society, and there's a lot of distrust at the moment in terms of trust in institutions. And I think that's being reflected back to us in what we're seeing in AI. And AI really is just reflecting to us what we sort of have become. So I feel that we need to start from a principles and values place when it comes to AI first. The longer I've spent in AI, the more I'm convinced we need to get back to that kind of, what is our vision? What sort of society are we trying to build? And, do we want a pervasive surveillance culture or not? Do we want, jobs and dignity or not? Do we want to protect freedom of speech and freedom of expression or not? And if we start there, that I think starts to build trust, because you're not coming in and saying, well, AI is coming whether you like it or not, and it's going to do these things and you need to adjust yourself. So you are all much more expert than I am in what that looks like in practice. But from my experience of the multi-stakeholder approach that Partnership on AI took, I think that those kinds of conversations, collaboration, consensus building, compromise is really the only way that I have seen to start to break down those barriers and encourage people across those different lines, industry, academia, civil society, to be able to work together. And the reason the book is called AI Needs You is because I do feel, as I said there, that this is something that people think they don't have a right to have a part in because they don't understand the deep technical workings of AI. And I do not think that is true. But that requires a sense of humility from the technology industry as to say, we actually don't know everything. And you may not know what we know, but we don't know what you know. And let's have those discussions. So it does require people to be a lot more, sort of vulnerable and trusting of each other, which is not really a popular standpoint at the moment in our politics.
So for those of you who haven't yet seen or read this fabulous book, the way in which it proceeds is through kind of 3 case studies from history, moments where society has grappled with significant changes in technological innovation, made it out the other side, and the lessons we can learn. And I would love just to talk about some of those examples. And the first one that you begin with is the space race. So would love for you to share why you chose that as an example and what lessons you think we can learn as we think about AI governance in the 21st century.
Yes, so I chose the space race. Well, I chose all the examples really because I think they have a lot to teach us about this current moment. The thing that's interesting about the space race is I don't look at the technical race itself. I don't spend a lot of time on the amount of US satellites versus Soviet Union ones. What I look at is the sort of diplomatic and legal innovation that took place alongside it, which is a really extraordinary sort of innovation and achievement in and of itself, such that by the time Neil Armstrong puts the first footprint on the moon, he does so legally under international law as a representative of all of humankind first and the United States second. When he plants a flag on the moon, he does not claim the moon for the United States, so the imagery is somewhat unhelpful, but coming from the UK, who have planted a lot of flags and claimed places in the past, let's overlook that, because it was an incredible thing to say, actually, we got to the moon first, but we do not own the moon. Nobody owns the moon. That was a legally decided thing under international law, this 1967 UN Outer Space Treaty. There was a huge amount of political leadership, diplomatic work, policy work that went into deciding those things. We take for granted now that space is the province of all mankind, but that was written into a treaty 2 years before anyone went to the moon, and we don't have nuclear weapons orbiting above us right now because of the decisions that were taken by those people at that time. And we're in a similar time for AI, and the real lesson that comes across in the book and all the examples is that these technologies are shaped by us. They are shaped by human beings. They are shaped by political decisions, societal opinions, and therefore AI is not something that's happened passively to us, but something that we will shape. And I think that's empowering. I mean, it can be frightening when you feel like society is not in a very good place right now, and that's what's reflecting back into AI. But it's empowering because you see that actually the power is, in our hands to shape what this technology looks like. And the space race particularly has a lot of lessons around kind of high-level geopolitical leadership, the way that the US began its space race for a very sort of national security, militaristic reasons. It was a Cold War, and it was a space race designed to win and to beat the Soviets, but chastened by things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which really, sort of frightened everybody involved. Kennedy makes this remarkable speech just before he dies to the UN to say, maybe there should be a joint moon mission. Space should not be owned by anybody. And this informs the set of legal freedom of space principles that eventually lead to this treaty. I think we're at that moment in AI now. We have to decide what we want this to look like. And we'll talk about the other examples, that's at the geopolitical level all the way down to the administrative level. And then we have to build AI and build regulation according to those sets of beliefs. And it's a really inspiring, for policymakers or people interested in the political process. All of the examples actually are really inspiring for how you realize what this work that we're all doing can actually ultimately lead to.
One of the things that you reflect on is that it really is a conscious choice, maybe for strategic and political gain, but to move from an antagonistic competitive frame to one that is a positive, affirmative, world-lifting vision for what it means to conquer space and to have that presence on the moon. I'm curious how you think we're doing in the global conversation on AI, and you can go in any direction from this. We mentioned already that you have been involved very much in the OECD work, the work of the GPI. Two different questions. One, how are we doing in setting forth the affirmative vision for how AI can lift up all humanity? And two, how are we doing in thinking what the international governance structures might look like to help support that?
Yes, I don't think we're doing great at the former. I don't think we're doing great at the positive vision for AI that uplifts humanity. So I've started this thing called the AI and Geopolitics Project at Cambridge, and that has emerged from really the lessons in this space example in the first chapter of the book, seeing how the stories we tell, the narratives we build, the decisions that we make shape what the future of science can look like. And if you think of the kind of really wonderful things that we have in terms of space now, the International Space Station is where Russian and Ukrainian cosmonauts could meet, even though war's happening on Earth. We have all this incredible technology that's come out of space because it's been kept sort of free and open. I think when I then look to the AI discussion, which if AI is discussed in geopolitical terms at all, it's discussed as an arms race between the US and China. Now, of course, you might say, well, the space race is discussed as an arms race, but then decisions are made actually to focus on collaboration and freedom, and as I said, space being the province of all mankind. Whereas what we seem to have at the moment is very much sort of, I think, real and understandable and valid legitimate concerns about countries wanting to be technologically advanced, turned into a framing that is making AI a battle to be won, something that there is a zero-sum game. We must win to beat that country. The US must do everything it can to stop China. Instead of, the US is going to use, and its allies are going to use AI to, help with the climate crisis, or we're gonna focus it around some of the incredible revolutions that we've seen with AI in healthcare, and we're gonna show what AI can really do to make the best version of society that inspires other nations to want to do that too. That is the way, I think, to structure it, rather than try and sort of antagonize and introduce competition and have a nationalistic, competitive, antagonistic framework, as you say, which will encourage people to feel they have to pick sides in some way. So that kind of vision that Kennedy was so good at, that vision and incredible hope and idealism for AI, I think is missing. The governance discussions, you're right, I've been part of them when I was at DeepMind, so probably from about 2016. We saw quite a lot of energy early on, led by the Canadians and the French around the G7 in, I think, 2017-18, when they had back-to-back presidencies. And they really wanted to set up something multi-stakeholder, forward-looking. They got very little engagement from the US administration at the time, and relatively little engagement from the UK at the political level, because both those countries were distracted by their own domestic troubles. And the Global Partnership on AI, which is separate from the Partnership on AI, confusingly, maybe has not been able to fulfill exactly what they hoped that it would fulfill in the beginning. Now we've seen that we've entered a new AI hype cycle. So that was part of the old one, then it kind of, people got a bit bored of AI, and then ChatGPT came along, and now everyone's interested in it again. But somehow this version of the hype cycle has become very arms race focused and very sort of almost militaristic in a sense. And there's this sense that, again, as I mentioned, that it's somehow AI is a battle to be won. Now, I'm absolutely comfortable with bodies like the G7, you know, coming to agreements amongst that group of like-minded countries, but we can't, in that race, completely ignore other parts of the globe. And I hope that while we're doing, you know, partnerships between the US and the UK and partnerships between the EU and the US, that we don't forget the fact that we have to bring other countries along with us, which is something that I talk about in the internet example in the book. So I think that it's promising. We're seeing a lot of energy around it. A lot of people care, and a lot of people are really keen to make sure that AI develops in a way that is ultimately beneficial. There's a lot of attention on that. I think that's a really positive thing, and I'm glad that more people are thinking about it now than ever. But I do think sometimes that the conversation, the framing of AI as this big long-term threat, as this big national security issue, AI as only a weapon, has somewhat colored the discussions.
Let's move briefly through the two other kind of periods of history, and it's very recent history that you go through in the book. And the second is drawing from the Warnock Committee, which was established in the UK to navigate kind of the bioethical debates that roiled the country and resonated around the world as IVF became available. Would love to hear a little bit about the lessons that you draw from that period.
Yes, it's a fascinating area that I think is much less well known in the space race, obviously. So IVF and human embryology research, the first IVF baby is born in 1978 in the UK. And what is initially a kind of wave of excitement about this new technology, especially the fact that it came from the UK, gives way quite quickly to deep concern and unease about what does this mean, combined with the advent of genetic editing capabilities. There's this huge, if not backlash, like unease that spreads particularly in the media, and government feels that they have to do something we take for granted now, because IVF and the life sciences and human embryology research is such a normal, accepted part of our lives. So I was kind of curious when I learned about this commission, well, how do we get there? If it was so controversial, how do we get to a point where it became not? And what the government do is they say, well, look, we don't know. This is new technology. We don't understand this ourselves. So we're going to set up an independent commission. And to our earlier discussion, your earlier question about how do we involve and make people feel that they can actually get involved in practice, well, the Warnock Commission does an incredible job. So they put in charge of this commission a philosopher, Baroness Mary Warnock, not a biologist or a scientist, although the biologists are members of this interdisciplinary commission. Also on the commission, you have legal scholars, social workers, religious representatives. They go up and down the country and consult with people, and they have submissions to them, and they go out and they ask people. They take in a huge amount of information and do a lot of work over a long time to come up with what they think is a potentially acceptable solution. And it's a long story I won't go into now, and it's has a lot of twists and turns. So if you're interested in politics, it's very political, this book. So if you're interested in politics at all, I think all the examples are fascinating. But the twists and turns of this one are really quite something. But the kind of key insight that they come up with is this idea of a 14-day rule, which is basically a limit on human embryology research. You can do it, but only up to this level. And there's no scientific reason for that at all. But what they decide is that there's enough concern in society, and in a democracy, people have the right to be heard. Mary Warnock says something, I'm going to butcher the quote, but it's something like, in a democracy, people expect to be listened to and have their concerns heard. And so we're going to introduce a limit. They later admit there's no scientific reason for that limit. And indeed, all the scientists reject it and say, no, this is nonsense. There's some pretty sexist articles about Mary Warnock in Nature magazine. But then actually a kind of rival group try and ban human embryology research entirely. They align with the anti-abortion movement. And the scientists realize, hang on, if we don't accept this limited compromise that Mary Warnock has come up with, we might lose everything. And in the end, they introduce a regulatory regime, which is the gold standard globally, and the UK has a flourishing life sciences sector. And what I think that teaches us is that limits on innovation do not have to mean that innovation suffers. Actually, limits and guardrails can allow businesses and innovation and scientists to flourish within what Warnock calls basically a strict but permissive regime. Strict in terms of where you're not allowed to go, but permissive within that so that innovation can flourish. And I think the AI industry and the technology industry needs to embrace that, because, you know, when you look at this Warnock example and you see the scientists saying, well, why 14 days? Why not 15? Why not 30? Being very picky about the limit that is set. You're missing the sort of wood for the trees there and saying it's not about that. It's about society feeling that their concerns have been listened to and there has been some sort of process to look at this and regulate it accordingly. And once that happens, they feel more comfortable with it. Now, interestingly, that didn't happen in the US. And that type of research remained and remains, I think, controversial, so that George W. Bush banned stem cell research entirely, and then Obama unbans it. And in the US, it became a partisan political issue instead of sort of a scientific, societal one.
There's a risk that I'm going to be ordered to hand in my civil society card if we have the outcome this be yet another commission. So there's some commission skepticism in the
fair enough.
community.
I actually open the chapter with famous politicians being mean about these commissions, and this is one that worked.
Right, no, exactly. And I do think you explained that beautifully. And to be clear, it's not a commission for commission's sake, right?
No.
They actually led to very concrete recommendations that did inform the regulatory landscape.
Yes, they set up the Human Embryology and Fertilization Authority, which still stands today and has removed basically this debate from politics by having an independent regulatory authority that people trust. So no, it led to something real, this one, but that may be down to Mary Warnock rather than anything else.
Let's clone her. So the final example that you draw from is the formation of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is a multi-stakeholder organization known to many in the CDT ecosystem because of its role helping maintain the infrastructure of the internet, the way in which websites are recalled when you make an inquiry. Would love for you to briefly touch on the lessons from this example, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of multi-stakeholderism and how we make that promise real going forward in the AI conversation.
Yes, and I'm so interested to hear because, you know, at CDT, you are all experts in this multi-stakeholder model, which I really believe in and think is important, and was kind of ICANN was kind of an inspiration for me when setting up partnership on AI. They're very different, but it was definitely an inspiration. And actually, the star of this chapter is Larry Strickling, who was director of the NTIA at the time, and he's here on the call. So I'm going to try and embarrass Larry. You know, a true public servant that works incredibly hard to ensure positive outcomes for society. And this is a book that is, in some senses, a love letter to policy making and the democratic process and the sort of, you know, tiresome, painstaking meetings we all have to have in, you know, windowless meeting rooms all over the world constantly. But, you know, which can feel sometimes tiring, but really leads to amazing results. So I think, you know, what there's many things to say about this chapter, and there's multiple lessons in each of the examples, but the one that I find fascinating is I basically had to split the internet example into two chapters, the internet pre 9/11 and the internet post 9/11. And that's because 9/11 is this huge rupture in how the US decided to approach internet regulation. So people will say that ICANN is not internet regulation, but I think actually it is, of course, a limited example of that. And it's an organic, multi-stakeholder organization which is established with sort of input and support from the US government, but really is kind of a bottom-up organization to start with. And they're established in 1998 under the Clinton-Gore administration, who have really seen the internet not as a weapon of war, even though it starts obviously in DARPA, and DARPA is just targeted with finding weapons of the future, and that's where the internet emerges. But they say, and this is actually this is going to go under the Department of Commerce. This is going to be part of our worldview, which is that we're going to spread sort of democratic, liberal market capitalism to the world through this kind of open and free communication method. So they see, this is a tool of economic power, and they put it in the Department of Commerce, and they want to work with the organic way that the internet has grown up. That kind of, they come from the sort of 60s countercultural sort of hippie idealism, and they kind of want to see that carry on, and promise that from 98 it will completely be removed from any US government role entirely by the year 2000. So instead of 2 years, it takes 20 years for that to happen. And it takes 20 years for that to happen, basically because 9/11 and change of administration, who go back to seeing the internet actually as a tool of war, and decide that, no, we want to clamp down and capitalize on this unique role that we have. And if you cast forward to the Snowden revelations that come out, and think what you like about Snowden, but the leaks certainly transformed the landscape politically and led to not just American adversaries, but American and British, because the UK was very involved in this, allies being furious. And we see at this meeting in 2012, as I say in the book, almost the internet getting broken. Not Kim Kardashian break the internet, but actually break the internet. And that's because kind of essentially what happens with those Snowden revelations is used by the sort of maybe not enemies, but certainly not friends of ICANN, to say ICANN doesn't work, and actually we need a different model that's not a multi-stakeholder model, that's not open and sort of consensus-driven and transparent, but is kind of brought into this different world. I think that would have had an extremely detrimental effect on the internet that we know today. And so we sort of take all of that for granted, don't we? But actually it turns out that people like Larry and his team decided to use sort of diplomatic power, US sort of soft power, to persuade other people, allies and non-aligned countries, to support the multi-stakeholder model, to support ICANN. And in doing so, I believe, sort of saved the open internet. But they managed to do that just before 2016. And who opposes this? Trump opposes it, and Ted Cruz opposes it. And Ted Cruz pulls Larry into a Senate hearing and castigates him for this work that he's doing, and implies that it's somehow against American interests. So you see how, when you look at the Warnock example, of course it was caught in the politics, but ultimately it was able to function as a kind of cross-party, independent, trusted body that from which a regulation emerged. But then as we get closer to today's moment, and this polarization and this increasing partisanship and refusal to work with each other, you see something as critical as ICANN under threat. And I think there's a positive story in that narrative. Again, there has to be. We have to cling on to the positive stories, was that actually the hard work did ensure that the open internet remained and that the multi-stakeholder model remained. But it's also a very significant caution to us all thinking about AI today, of just how much it can get caught up into politics. And we were just talking about this, of course. It's starting to happen. And I think it's very important that those of us that want to see AI turn out well continue to try and support the idea of multi-stakeholderism, the idea of different voices at the table all mattering, and maybe not perfect outcomes, but consensus-driven outcomes, coalitions of people coming together to work together.
I think one of the insights you have in the book is that actually you have this both in the multi-stakeholder section and in talking about commissions. It's not like there needs to be one body to rule it all, where all AI conversations go into the, into the depths of time, but really thinking about targeted places where a set of decisions need to be made about the appropriate governance framework for an AI system or particular kind of area where AI significantly impacts humans. So those could be chunked off for this type of work. And I'd love just to hear you talk a little bit about kind of where you see the opportunities for multi-stakeholderism in AI governance.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I say about ICANN, it's not perfect, but the fact that it exists at all is what's so remarkable. And it doesn't cover much, it doesn't deal with many of the kind of pressing internet issues now, but it does deal with this one really big important one, and that's valid. And I do think we get into this space these days where if it doesn't fix everything, we don't want to do it. And it's so easy for people to detract, just like with the Mary Warnock example. Well, that's not exactly scientifically, technically perfect and rational, so we don't do it. Well, that doesn't solve every problem, so we don't do it. But we can pick off these different areas. And one of the examples that I think has been really encouraging to me in the past sort of year or so is what Partnership on AI have done with their synthetic media code of conduct. They have brought together, I might get this wrong, I think CDT were part of it, but I think it was BBC, New York Times, I think OpenAI were involved, other technology companies were involved, sort of came together to have a discussion about this very difficult issue. And they're not going to solve everything. They're not going to prevent deep fakes being used in a way that is harmful completely. But what they were able to do is kind of, powerful representatives in their own right, is listen to each other's concerns, and from that suggest a code of conduct that I think will have an impact. But sometimes the idea of a sort of narrow, multi-stakeholder code of conduct or set of practices is just not sort of sexy enough for people somehow. They want a big new piece of legislation. They want to fix everything. And that's also good. I think there's also the EU AI Act is also, it's also good to do that too. But what Larry talks about is this idea of permissionless policy making. And I felt really inspired by that. You don't actually have to wait all the time for everything to be done at a sort of federal level or national level. Sometimes people can come together and decide themselves. And see that, I didn't talk about all these in the book, but there's lots of industries where they do that. Now, you kind of tip over sometimes there into self-regulation, and obviously that can be counterproductive. And I think there is a place for self-regulation, but if it's in place of real meaty legislation as well, then that's not right. But I do think that we can sort of peel off these issues, and even if we can't find common ground on everything, maybe we can find common ground on this one thing. And not only is that good for the results of that, but it's good for building that muscle of collaboration and compromise and working together.
Yeah, I mean, I think for CDT, we very much view it that way. In particular, there are going to be areas where it's literally just hard to regulate or legislate, either because you're moving into free expression territory, and so for constitutional reasons in the US or freedom of expression purposes in other regions of the world, it's very hard for a law to say thou shalt treat X content in this manner. Or to your point, where the regulatory cycle is just so long, or has to be at a certain level of abstraction. And so actually, how do you interpret those rules? And I think we're going to see this even with the European AI Act. There's going to be a lot of coloring between the lines that's going to have to rely on more than just the letter of the law, but how are companies responsibly interpreting their obligations under that law? And to my mind, I think those are some of the areas where multi-stakeholderism can be particularly important. And in a way, there are some lessons to be drawn from the social media context where, again, what content is good or bad is incredibly subjective, not something that we want the government involved in on a kind of a decision basis. But the frameworks for responsible governance, what does good look like in terms of good conduct by a company? How do they add civil society consultation to how those decisions are made? What's the transparency reporting or accounting that they're doing to say these are the types of content moderation decisions that we're making and here's how we're enforcing them? It's always risky to analogize to the social media context, but there are kind of methods of doing these things. And there I'm referencing the Santa Clara Principles as a specific example for content moderation, where again, this notion that there should be civil society in dialogue with the companies, and the companies should have a level of transparency and accountability in the decisions they're making, feels like an important thing to draw on.
I think so, and I think that that's good for the companies too. And obviously I used to work inside one of the companies at Google and then at DeepMind. And the team I set up at DeepMind, one of my sort of strong principles for my strategy and with the team was that we need to earn trust. We're not just trying to, sometimes people talk about how can we build trust? How can we encourage people to trust? You have to earn trust, and you do that by opening up, being transparent, working with people, talking to people. Being transparent, by the way, doesn't have to mean being transparent to everybody about everything, but bringing in trusted scrutiny and accountability, I think, is really important. And I really agree with what you said about even the EU AI Act leaving room for interpretation. So I run the Cambridge AI and Geopolitics project, but I also run a consultancy working with businesses on AI, and particularly around how they do responsible innovation, responsible deployment outside of the law. And I think it's interesting with AI that we are seeing people try and get ahead of it. So saying, well, here's my sort of obligations. That's my classic sort of compliance obligations. But people instinctively understanding that there's something about AI that may be different, or something about the digital space that may be different. That this is kind of dynamic and changing. And we understand that the harms are very real already. And so even if they're not legislated for, they are there, and kind of not wanting to do that. And in that case, I'm always telling people to consider setting up these sort of multi-stakeholder bodies. Maybe it's a multi-stakeholder group within inside it, maybe it's a cross-functional group inside the company, but involving the experts from outside, no matter what their expertise is in, depending on what the company, involving your workers in decisions about the tech that they're going to have to use. And something that I know CDT is very aware of, but sometimes we're having these very theoretical discussions about AI when we're talking about harms. They are already here. If you want to know what to be concerned about when it comes to AI and surveillance, for example, then you might want to ask a delivery driver who has live facial recognition cameras on him the whole time, him or her or they, has seatbelt sensors all around the car, is being tracked and monitored and kept to time. Someone who feels completely monitored their entire working day. That's someone to talk to. That's someone to bring into the conversation, rather than necessarily always sort of AI experts.
I love that example, because I've been spending, CDT as a workers' rights project, and we spend quite a lot of time with the unions kind of seeing how technology is impacting the lives of workers today. And to your point, it's one of the most creative areas for what it is to truly work with impacted communities. And we've seen real wins where it's not just the workers saying, reject the tech, which sometimes you get painted at, but saying, no, consult us in the design and deployment of this tech. And we actually are the ones who know how to do this job. We know how the technology is going to make us more efficient, and we can also tell you if it's going to make us less efficient. And so one of the most important movements I've seen in the past 2 years, really kind of come out more loudly in the AI conversation, is just what participatory design looks like with the people who are actually going to be using the tools on a daily basis. And if you do that, you get the benefit not only of having workers actually brought along in the process, but better design choices too.
I completely agree, and it sort of baffles me that people don't want to do that. It seems such a win-win, frankly, of like keeping people bought into the process and also improving whatever you're ultimately designing and deploying yourself. I think government has a lot to learn from that too. The thing that I love about the Warnock Commission is the fact that it has social workers involved. It has it has the biologists, but it also has the people who are kind of dealing with, at the time they're very interested in what it meant for families. So they have people that work with families and children's charities, and that's just as important as the tech. And I guess that's sort of my overarching thesis in the book, is that the reason it's called AI Needs You is because I think people feel at the moment that if they're not an AI expert, then they have no place in the debate. But I think that the opinion, what we say in a democracy is that everybody's opinion matters. And I think if you are not a deep technical expert in AI, that does not mean that your opinion about what type of society you want to live in the future is any less valid. And that's all these discussions about AI really are and should be. What type of society are we trying to build? What type of society do we want to live in? How do we want to treat each other? And then the AI regulation should fit into that, not, starting from a premise of, an AI first society and an AI first approach. It should be society and people first.
I would love to kind of take your temperature on another theme of this cultural moment that we're in, which is often we are seeing in the current round of kind of AI hype cycle, this really polarized conversation that you either are focused on kind of long-term safety risks, this maybe ties back to the space race conversation, or you're thinking about AI harms in the here and now. There are some who are trying to bridge those two conversations and say that, yes, we need to do both, and actually working on current harms helps build the muscle and infrastructure to deal on long-term harms. But the first question I have is really just a fact one. You spent so much time in one of the global cutting-edge companies, really pushing the envelope in terms of creative uses of AI. And so I'm curious how you view the safety conversation and how you view the risk of polarization between those debates and kind of how we move the conversation forward.
Yeah, it's been incredibly disappointing to watch what's happened over the past couple of years with this, because when I was at DeepMind, we had sort of long-term safety and sort of technical. I think we call it sort of technical safety teams who are focusing on alignment and those types of issues. And that was outside of my team, which was DeepMind Ethics and Society. But we worked really closely with them and partnered with them, and people in my team had regular meetings with them, and they supported our work and we supported their work. And it came from a plurality of perspectives, which I think is a good thing, which is what they wanted to work on and felt was important, was different from what we wanted to work on and felt was most important. But it was something that we discussed and collaborated on and respected each other's viewpoint. And I think it made all of us better because of that. And something has happened, in the past couple of years, where it's sort of attempted to make you have to pick one camp or the other. And I don't think the tech industry has helped itself there by, I don't just, by the way, when I say tech industry and AI, I don't mean like just big tech. I mean people in the AI community, academia, all sorts of different companies, governments. We've seen there was a period of time recently where we seemed to only communicate with each other in open letter format. And so we had all these open letters to each other saying, we have to prioritize this. And I was like, what happened when we just all used to talk together and work together? And I don't think it's helped that there was this kind of moment of mania, sort of suggesting that AI was an existential threat that should be put on a par with nuclear weapons and pandemics. And but I don't, at that point, I don't even sort of blame. People have a right to think that, and I think a lot of the people that signed that letter have thought that for a long time and wholeheartedly believe it, and that's their right. And they're people of integrity who believe deeply what they say. It's not even about disagreeing with that. I happen to disagree with that personally. I don't think we should think about AI as an extinction level threat on a par with pandemics and nuclear weapons. I don't see AI as a existential threat to humanity. I don't think AI is the unique technology in the history of humanity that we can't deal with. I think we have dealt with technological change throughout human history, and we will be able to do so again. The issue for me is not the people are saying that, but the sort of politicians and others only listening to that perspective and not listening to the wide range of other perspectives, and falling into the dichotomy where you have to be one or the other, where you have to be aligned with one of these two visions in a way that I don't think is representative of AI or the AI community, really. And I don't honestly know exactly why that's happened. My hunch is that it's something to do with what I was saying before, where AI is kind of reflecting back to us the society that we are in, the moment that we're in, because of a multitude of different events and issues, economics, cultural, political, that we've become a very polarized society. And so somehow AI reflected that back to us, and this discussion around long-term safety or current harms suddenly had to be polarized too. And I don't think it has to be. I know lots of people working on long-term safety who really value the work of, the amazing work that Professor Alondra Nelson did in the White House, working on civil rights and human rights around AI, even though that didn't necessarily directly touch on that. Likewise, I know people that care most about current harms. I put myself in this bucket, who really respect the sort of people working on those long-term safety issues and can see some of their arguments. So I don't know exactly why it's happened, but I think it's not what my experience was at all when I was at DeepMind. And I think it's a sign that this sort of second big hype cycle around AI has got away from us a little bit. That's one of the examples. It's the same when you see it's open or closed models, or woke AI or racist AI, or Elon calls it woke and racist. I don't know. I've got lost track of what that perspective is. But he literally puts up a picture where you have to choose one path or the other, and one's bad and one's good. I think AI is just us. It's just a reflection of us, and so unfortunately, it's reflecting back this very polarized, divisive moment.
All right, we're going to turn to audience Q&A. Both, I think we have some coming in over the internet and some in person. Let's privilege people in the room first. How's that? I think we're going mic-less, and I'm going to just synthesize and repeat what you say. Is that the instruction from the tech team? Excellent.
Sure, and I can speak loudly. Hi, I'm Prince Verity at New Technology Institute. Thanks for this very interesting conversation. Thanks to you both. One question, picking up on this open-closed sort of false binary that you raised at the end. I'm curious, you mentioned earlier in the discussion that there's this pervasive mistrust and a lack of idealism around AI and the direction it can take society, or the direction society can take it, to take your framing, which I agree with. Is part of that, in your view, because many of the big tech companies that have sort of been reviled or mistrusted for quite some time are largely the faces of innovation and consumer-facing products that we see with AI today? I'm not saying that characterization is always fair, but I'm wondering if you locate in that some of the sources of the lack of idealism.
It's I'm sure that has something to do with it. And I think, there's fairly, people see that companies getting richer and more powerful, and then they're seeing and being told by sometimes people at those companies that they are leading the advance of a new technology that's so powerful that it might wipe out humanity one day. And then they look at those two things and feel distrustful. I mean, I think that's why I say AI communities brought it on themselves sometimes. If you go out and tell people to be frightened of something, that it might one day kill you, but don't worry, we've got it and we'll look after it, I think that's quite fairly going to make people feel distrustful. And we've seen it slightly sometimes with politicians too. I mean, in the UK, the current Prime Minister said he buys into this notion that AI is an existential threat, and set up a whole AI summit structure based on that worldview solely, but then said, I'm not going to regulate though. Which is kind of the opposite to this Warnock example, where they say, look, you're worried, I don't think you need to be worried, but I understand that you're worried, so we're going to look at it. And people want to feel that their institutions are on top of things. And I think right now they feel that their institutions are not on top of things, because the people building AI are extremely powerful technology companies who, in the US, let's just take the US example, have not been really meaningfully regulated. I think that's fair to say, right? The US hasn't even passed a privacy law, whereas maybe in Europe, because of GDPR and all these other things, maybe there's a bit more of, okay, the politicians seem to be all over this a little bit more. So, I worked inside Google. There's a lot of amazing people there, and I still love the company. But I think if you even think that, it's important to hold these companies to account, and they mess up sometimes, and they're extraordinarily big and powerful, and that's something that needs to be scrutinized. I think most people there even understand that. So I think you're probably right that that's got quite a lot to do with it, and I think that's fair enough.
And one dynamic, I was a delegate to the UK AI Safety Summit, and what was fascinating about it is that the framing very much was a safety going into it, and the Prime Minister was kind of framing it as tackling a specific piece of the puzzle. overwhelmingly in the room, when you had policymakers from other countries, they wanted to talk about current harms, regulatory landscape, not because they were ignoring the safety harms, but because they are very focused on AI for the SDGs and for a positive vision that's going to elevate their countries and how they regulate potential risks to their communities now. So it was encouraging to see that we can have both.
Yeah.
And almost, humanity is going to resist being cabined to just focusing on one piece of the problem. The others are going to naturally bubble up because they're so urgent and pressing right now.
And the next, I know there's the virtual one in South
Korea.
Korea, but the one in France, led by Macron, is much more broadly focused from what I can see of the advisory group so far and knowing some of the people involved. So I don't think it will have that. I think that's a lesson learned. I think the UK, maybe was well intentioned, but kind of showed it was frustrating given that the UK has quite a lot of really talented civil servants and a great landscape that have been working on a much broader definition of AI safety for a long time. For that to be the only framing. So you're right. It is encouraging that it kind of got wrestled back, but the Prime Minister has a certain political view, and I think that fitted with his political view, and I think he was maybe did not consult as broadly as he could have done.
Other questions, please.
Hi, my name is Noah. Sorry, this is for me.
Yes, for you. Perfect. Go ahead now.
Noah Cole from Ometeor Network. I work on the Responsible Tech team. I really loved a lot of what you had to say about the multi-stakeholder aspect of getting different institutions in the room. The issue that we see from this perspective is just such a lack of trust, often from industry not trusting civil society or vice versa, which I love how you put how companies need to earn trust. And so seeing that as a challenge of multi-stakeholder engagement, who do you think is doing this really well in terms of multi-stakeholder engagement, engaging the industry with AI, and what makes them successful?
Can you partly echo the question as you answer so folks online can hear?
Yes. Okay. So the question being, what are good examples of multi-stakeholder organizations building trust between participants? And that's kind of why I wrote this chapter around ICANN, because I saw this as a inspiration for the multi-stakeholder model, which was when they were kind of fighting to save it, was suggested by all different types of political viewpoints and sort of opposers of it, that it would lead to all these terrible outcomes, and actually none of that has come to pass. And I think that's what I kind of would reflect back to those involved in these discussions who fear being open and trusting the people involved, is that, but there is no other way if you want this to be a truly sort of diverse and beneficial technology. The only one that I know about that I can talk to with any degree of knowledge is Partnership on AI, which I should say I helped to co-found, so I'm sure biased, but I'm not involved anymore. And we set that up because it emerged from essentially the AI research scientists at the companies who kind of were maybe more used to that academic environment where sharing and collaboration is much more normal, and wanted to be able to still have a space for that despite now being inside proprietary companies. And we set that up, and it was funding from those big tech companies, so civil society were very understandably suspicious, but because of their good faith in getting involved and us structuring the board so that it was 50-50 for-profit and not-for-profit, I think we were able to earn trust that people saw that our intentions were good and what we were trying to do, and joined up and then got involved in good faith. And I think that they've gone from strength to strength. Personally, I think things like the Synthetic Media Code of Conduct, their work on model safety, has consistently earned trust, from what I can tell now from the outside, from both the sort of for-profit and not-for-profit communities, because of the way that the good faith way that they're engaging in it. And I mean, I'm sure, will be able to talk more eloquently than I can about why they think that works. But I think respecting all of those viewpoints is really critical to that. And when I saw the Foundation Model Forum be set up outside of that, I was just concerned that civil society weren't around that table and what that meant. I suppose, and this is not based on any insider knowledge, I suppose companies would argue they want a space where they can talk as companies. And I think that's fine, but if you're going to continue to earn and build trust such that people will get around the table with you in a multi-stakeholder format, you have to make sure that there's a degree of disclosure and transparency around what you're doing. I think that transparency or disclosure debate is going to be the next big one that we have, and we should start thinking about that now. What does that look like? The point that you made earlier in terms of, looking at the social media model is people are going to feel more confident and more trustful if they can see what's going on and can discuss it and debate it and scrutinize it. And I think that's a good thing. I think it helps as a company if you've got sort of critical friends holding you to account. I really do. I think that's something people should embrace.
And I'll take moderator's prerogative just to weigh in a little bit and say, I do think this is a critical year for proving that concept that multi-stakeholderism can work in the AI setting. PAI has pioneered a couple really good projects around this, but we've also seen, whether it's the Frontier Model Forum, we saw a big announcement from 20 companies around their election detection for synthetic images at the Munich Accord that was just a press release between companies without civil society formally at the table. We spoke with them as they were developing it. There are mechanisms for civil society consultation, but we have to make that real, and we have to show that that model can work before we slip into this new way of being where the companies can just talk to each other behind a wall and hope that people like what comes out of that discussion.
Well, look, I completely agree. And the other thing I want to add is that I think this sort of arms race narrative is the source of a lot of that. Because actually, if you continue to believe and accept that AI is an arms race and it's a battle between the US and China, it becomes a lot easier to say, well, we're not going to be transparent about anything. We're not going to involve anybody. We have to keep all of this on lockdown. And whether or not you see it as the companies convincing the politicians telling the companies, or whoever it is, the point is if we don't start to unpick those very competitive nationalistic framings and turn this into something that's more about a kind of vision of collaboration and cooperation, then all of those types of things that undermine the multi-stakeholder model and undermine trust flow from that too. And that's why I think this has been so damaging as a narrative, because it's an excuse to not do anything, really. It's an excuse to say, we can't reveal anything, we can't do anything, because if we do, China are there waiting. And I actually think that the way that we inspire and the way that we succeed, even if this is an arms race, which I'm not sure that it is, but even if it is, the way you succeed, and always have succeeded, I think, is by encouraging other people to fight for their freedoms by defending and promoting ours, not ourselves trying to ape a model of secrecy.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question quickly, Tamara. Let's go to the back.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tamara Catlin. I focus on tech and civil rights on the CDT Advisory Council. And I wanted to iterate a little bit on your question. I really love what you said about earning trust. Currently, I'm working on a project that is basically looking at languages, linguistics, documentation, and large language models. And part of what we're wrestling with is this community-informed design as opposed to a community-designed, model. And so much of what we're seeing is that it's really difficult to sort of retroactively build tools to be ethical. And so that sort of begs a larger question around, what does it mean to slow down versus what you're talking about, which is this AI arms race. But I would say just even competitively within companies, there's an AI arms race. Mm-hmm. And so as you look at some of these historical examples, how do you see, if you had a sort of crystal ball, how do you see this playing out? Is this multi-stakeholder accountability every step along the way? Is this, do we have to just drive on getting real legislation in the US? Like how do you see this sort of playing out to get to ultimately better outcomes? I know it's a very big question, unfortunately.
Briefly, yes. I guess I want to be positive and say that my experience of the AI community, including all the people in this room, is such that I feel confident that there's enough well-intentioned people trying to drive towards the right thing, that we will be able to get there. But the trajectory of the debate hasn't necessarily always supported that. But as Alex said, I think participatory design and multi-stakeholder models are the best chance that we have at that. And I don't know that we can legislate to force that to happen. I think that's going to have to come from us and from building spaces for trusted conversations and to, as we say, sort of exercise that muscle of collaboration.
What a beautiful way to end this conversation. The book is AI Needs You. The author is Verity Harding. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.